Millions of Americans right now, not in a developing country, right here in the US, cannot drink their tap water, cannot afford to see a doctor, and cannot pay rent on a full-time salary. And the craziest part, this is the richest country on earth. So, how does that happen? How does a nation with more billionaires than anywhere else on the planet end up with millions of its own people living without the basics? Because the problem is not that the money is not there. The problem is where it stops reaching. And once you see exactly where that line is and how close it runs to ordinary people living completely normal lives, you will not look at this country the same way again. Let's start with something almost nobody thinks to question. Water. You wake up. You walk to the kitchen. You turn on the faucet. Now imagine the water that comes out is brown. Most people's first instinct would be broken pipes somewhere nearby. A temporary service interruption. Call the utility company. Grab a few bottles from the store. Wait for it to clear up. Normal assumption. Reasonable reaction. Now imagine it does not clear up. Imagine that it's just Tuesday and Wednesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. That is the actual daily reality for families in parts of rural Appalachia, tribal communities across the Southwest, and struggling urban neighborhoods spread across multiple states. There are households in the United States where people simply do not use the tap for drinking water. They buy bottled water by the case. They haul containers in from other locations. Some rely on private wells that have never been properly tested for safety. And they do this not because they are uninformed. They do it because experience has already taught them that the water coming out of their pipes cannot be trusted. Here is where it becomes hard to explain away. According to the US Environmental Protection Agency, millions of Americans are currently dependent on water systems that are well past their useful lifespan. Many of the pipes delivering water to homes today were installed 50, 60, even 70 or more years ago. Replacing and modernizing the nation's water infrastructure is estimated to cost hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming decades. For large cities, that is a serious challenge. For smaller communities with limited tax bases and shrinking local budgets, it can feel genuinely impossible. So repairs get delayed, projects get pushed back, and residents keep using the water they have because no one is offering them an alternative. But the part that really stays with you is not the infrastructure gap. It is that most people in these communities have stopped expecting it to change. When a problem exists long enough without any resolution, the mind starts to reclassify it. What once felt alarming becomes routine. What once seemed unacceptable becomes just the background condition of daily life. You stop calling it a crisis because calling it a crisis implies it is going to be fixed. In wealthier parts of the same country, water quality is not even a topic of conversation. You turn on the tap, you drink. But in poorer, more rural, more isolated communities, filling a glass from the kitchen faucet has become something people actually think twice about. And when you cannot trust something that basic, one of the most fundamental things a home is supposed to provide, it raises a question that goes well beyond pipes and infrastructure. If you cannot count on that, what can you count on? Now picture a different household. Someone has been dealing with persistent back pain for several months. Nothing dramatic, just a dull, relentless ache that makes sleeping hard and limits what they can do throughout the day. They know they should see a doctor. They have not gone, not because there is no hospital nearby. There is one, not because they do not understand what is at stake. They do. They have not gone because the cost, the office visit, the imaging, the follow-up appointments, the potential prescription, even with insurance, would likely come out to more money than they can safely absorb right now. So they wait. They manage it. They hope it resolves on its own. This is not an unusual story. According to KFF, one of the leading health policy research organizations in the country, a significant number of American adults have delayed or skipped medical care specifically because of cost. Not because a hospital was too far, not because they were unaware of the problem, because they could not afford it. Now, hold that against this one fact. The United States spends nearly 18% of its entire gross domestic product on healthcare. That is more than almost any other developed nation on Earth. The hospitals exist, the specialists exist, the diagnostic technology exists. By global standards, the American healthcare system is enormous and well-resourced. And yet, for a substantial portion of the population, That system is functionally out of reach. The problem almost never starts as a crisis. It starts with the ordinary, a dental issue that gets put off because dental care is expensive. A routine screening that gets skipped year after year. A symptom that seems manageable enough to live with until the day it is not manageable anymore. What happens next is well documented. Small problems left untreated become larger ones. Larger ones are more complicated and more expensive to address. The person who delayed care because of cost is now facing a more serious condition and a significantly bigger financial burden than they would have faced had they been able to go in months or years earlier. That is the actual cost of a system that is technically present but practically unreachable for too many people. The distance between an American and the medical care they need is not measured in miles. It is measured in dollars. And for millions of people, that distance has become genuinely uncrossable. Here is a statistic that sounds like it has to be wrong. There is not a single state in the United States where a full-time worker earning minimum wage can comfortably afford a standard 2-bedroom apartment. Not one, not anywhere in the country. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, millions of households now spend more than half of their monthly income on housing alone. Housing researchers have a specific term for this. They call it being severely cost-burdened. It used to describe a narrow extreme edge of the population, people in very unusual circumstances. It now describes a widespread and growing condition. And here is the piece that tends to genuinely surprise people. A growing share of those experiencing housing instability right now are employed. They show up to work every week. They receive a paycheck. By every standard measure, they are participating in the economy the way the system expects them to. And they still cannot hold on to a stable place to live. Some live in their cars. Some cycle between extended stay motels, paying more per night on a weekly rate than a proper lease would actually cost them, but unable to pull together a security deposit. Some move between relatives' homes, technically housed but without any real permanence or stability. What makes this difficult to dismiss is how gradually it tends to unfold. It almost never begins with one catastrophic event. It begins with a rent increase of $150 a month, then a reduction in work hours, then a car repair, then an unexpected medical bill. Each one feels manageable or nearly manageable on its own, but stacked on top of each other over several months, they push someone past a threshold that is very hard to come back from. A home is more than just a place to sleep. It is the address on a job application. It is the stable environment where children can actually learn. It is the foundation from which any long-term plan becomes possible at all. When that foundation goes, everything else built on top of it becomes uncertain almost immediately. If you are finding this useful so far, drop a comment below. Does any of this match what you're actually seeing around you? Now, think about what happens when you need to get somewhere and you simply cannot. In most American cities, transportation is a decision you barely register. You drive, take a bus, call a rideshare. It is so automatic you do not even think of it as a decision. Step outside the urban core into suburban edges, rural towns, communities that were built entirely around the assumption that every household owns a working vehicle, and the picture changes completely. In those places, a car is not a convenience. It is infrastructure. It is the system itself. Think about a situation like this. A single father in a rural Midwestern county. His truck has had a transmission problem he has been putting off addressing. The repair would run around $500. He plans to save for it over the next couple of months. Then one morning, the truck simply stops, does not start at all. He has a shift beginning in 3 hours at a distribution warehouse 18 miles away. There is no bus route connecting his part of the county to the warehouse. The only rideshare option in his area is unreliable and would cost more than he makes in the shift. He misses that shift. Then the next one, while he tries to arrange the repair, his employer, operating a strict attendance policy, terminates him after the 4th absence. A broken truck did not just end a workday. It ended a job. According to research on transportation access in the United States, tens of millions of people live in areas where public transit either does not exist or is far too limited to serve as a realistic daily commuting option. That creates a specific kind of fragility that is invisible from the outside because on the surface roads exist, cars exist, everything looks functional. But underneath that surface is a system where one vehicle failure at the wrong moment can set off a chain of consequences that is genuinely difficult to stop. In a country where getting to work, reaching a hospital, buying groceries, and accessing most basic services all require the ability to drive, the car has quietly become the single most critical piece of personal infrastructure in millions of people's lives, and freedom in that very concrete context is not an abstract concept. It is the specific question of whether your car started this morning. Let's take a breath here for a moment, because there is a longer arc underneath all of this that is worth slowing down to understand. For decades, the agreement at the center of American life was pretty simple. Study hard, earn a degree, and you would have access to a level of economic stability your parents might not have had. Education was the escalator. You got on, you worked hard, you moved upward. And for a long time, that actually held true for a lot of people. Student loan debt in the United States has now surpassed $1.7 trillion. The average borrower who completes a 4-year program leaves with somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 in debt. They do not start adult life at zero. They start in a financial hole, not after they have had a chance to get established, but from the very first day they are getting started. And that debt is not abstract. It delays home ownership. It compresses career choices, pushing people toward higher-paying paths, regardless of whether those paths actually fit them, simply because the monthly payment requires it. It makes saving for anything else significantly harder. It narrows options at exactly the age when options should feel most wide open. But here is what most people miss when this topic comes up. The problem does not even start at the college level. The K-12 education system in the United States is funded heavily through local property taxes, which means the quality of education a child receives is substantially shaped by the neighborhood they happen to have been born into. Schools in wealthier districts tend to have more resources, more experienced teachers, stronger support systems, and much better preparation for what comes next. Schools in lower income areas typically have less of all of those things. The gap in outcomes does not start with effort or attitude or ability. It starts with geography. So, by the time a young person reaches the point of deciding whether to pursue higher education, the starting position is already deeply unequal. Then they take on significant debt trying to close that gap. Then they emerge with a degree that may or may not translate into wages sufficient to manage that debt, while also building any kind of financial foundation underneath themselves at the same time. The path still exists. The diplomas are still being issued, but the destination the path was supposed to lead to, a stable, upwardly mobile adult life, is becoming less and less reliably reachable. What a lot of young people feel at the start of adulthood today is not optimism. It is the weight of a debt that arrived before the career even had a chance to begin. And about that career, most people assume that once you are employed, once you have regular income coming in, the basics are handled. You can plan, you can save a little. Life has enough of a floor to build from. The data suggests that assumption no longer holds for a very large portion of the workforce. Remember the number from the beginning of this video? More than 40% of American adults cannot cover a $400 emergency without borrowing money or selling something. What makes that figure so significant is not just the dollar amount. It is what it reveals about the actual structure of everyday financial life in this country right now. These are employed people. People with direct deposits and work schedules and responsibilities. People who are doing what the system asks of them. But the margin between what they earn and what their life actually costs has been squeezed so tight that almost any unexpected expense tips them into crisis territory. A $700 car repair is not a minor inconvenience. It is potentially the loss of the job that car gets them to every day. A $300 medical bill after insurance is not just a health expense. It is a disruption that ripples through every other financial decision for the rest of that month. A rent increase of $150 per month is not a market adjustment. It is the beginning of a calculation that may not work out anymore. Here is the critical point. None of those events are unusual. Car repairs, medical bills, rent increases, these are the ordinary, completely predictable turbulences of a normal human life. They are not surprises. They are just life. The problem is that the financial structure underneath tens of millions of American families can no longer absorb them the way it once could. The shock absorbers are gone. Every bump in the road goes straight through. If this is landing differently than you expected, hit the like button. It helps more people find this kind of content. Now, think about what all of this looks like at the other end of a working life. Retirement was supposed to be the reward, the part of life where the financial pressure finally lets up. You worked for decades. You saved what you could. You participated in the system. And in return, the system was supposed to provide some basic security in your later years. For a growing number of older Americans, that exchange is simply not delivering. When you are retired, your income is fixed. There are no more raises coming, no extra shifts to pick up, no salary reviews, no performance bonuses, no side income you can ramp up when costs climb, and yet almost nothing around you stays fixed. Rent keeps going up, medical costs keep going up, groceries cost more, utilities cost more, the cost of simply existing keeps rising, while the income available to meet it stays exactly where it is. According to studies on housing and income for older Americans, millions of seniors are spending more than half of their monthly income on housing alone. At that level, the margin for everything else, medications, food, transportation, any unexpected cost at all, essentially disappears. A single hospital stay, a broken appliance, a car repair, any one of those things can wipe out whatever small buffer existed. And here is the part that really challenges the simple explanation. Many of the older Americans now in this situation are not people who never thought about retirement. They worked for decades in stable careers. They saved what they reasonably could. They paid into systems they were told would hold. What happened is that the world around them shifted faster than their plans could accommodate. According to data on homelessness in the United States, older adults have become one of the fastest growing segments of the unhoused population. People who at 50 could not have imagined their circumstances at 70. People who made the expected decisions, followed the expected path, and still ended up without a reliable floor underneath them. When a system can no longer provide real security in old age, the question becomes very simple and very direct. Was doing everything right actually enough? That question, it turns out, is something a growing number of Americans are now asking about the future in general, not just retirement. For generations, the core belief at the center of American life was not a guarantee of any specific outcome. It was a direction, the expectation that the next generation would have it better than the one before. That however hard things were at any given moment, the overall arc pointed upward. That things were moving towards something. According to surveys by the Pew Research Center and other major polling organizations, the share of Americans who believe the next generation will be economically better off than they are has fallen to some of the lowest levels recorded in the modern era of polling. The majority now doubt it, not as a passing worry that comes and goes, but as a settled, considered expectation about where things are actually headed. This matters more than it might initially seem. Societies can carry enormous amounts of hardship when the underlying belief in forward progress stays intact. People endure difficulty more readily when they feel the difficulty is temporary. When what they are going through feels like a hard chapter in a longer story that is ultimately going somewhere better, that belief is load-bearing. It holds a lot of other things up. But when the belief in the direction of travel starts to erode, something more fundamental shifts. The hardship itself may not change, but the frame around it collapses, and what once felt like a difficult stretch in an upward journey becomes something much harder to put words to. Confidence in institutions is declining. Trust in the systems that were built to provide stability is weakening. And increasingly, the honest answer to whether doing everything right guarantees a secure future is simply, not necessarily. That is a significant shift in how people understand the deal they are part of, which brings us to food. Because food connects everything we have covered to something even more basic than income or policy. Most people, when the topic of nutrition comes up, think about choices. Eat more vegetables. Choose fresh food over processed. Buy whole ingredients instead of packaged ones. The advice sounds simple because in many parts of this country it genuinely is simple. The grocery store is close. The produce section is full. The decision is personal. But in millions of communities across the United States, That choice does not exist in any meaningful sense. Researchers and public health officials call these areas food deserts, places both urban and rural where residents have no practical access to a full-service supermarket with fresh food at affordable prices. What they do have access to are convenience stores, gas stations, dollar stores, and fast food. There is food available, just not the kind that most nutritionists would recognize as the foundation of a healthy diet. Think about a family on the south side of a large Midwestern city. No car, dependent on a bus system that runs infrequently. The nearest full grocery store is 6 miles away. The round trip by bus, including transfers, takes well over an hour. With a demanding work schedule and a small child at home, that trip is not something that happens every week. It happens when it can. So, most meals are built from whatever is available within walking distance. Not because the family does not understand what is healthier, because the healthier option is simply not accessible to them in any practical day-to-day sense. According to the US Department of Agriculture, millions of Americans live in exactly this situation. And what makes it more striking is that many of these food deserts are not in the most remote corners of the country. They exist inside major cities, sometimes just blocks away from busy commercial streets, somehow cut off from the supply chains that automatically stock the stores in wealthier neighborhoods. The health consequences are not subtle or debatable. Communities with the least access to fresh food show consistently higher rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and other chronic conditions directly tied to diet over time. And then a cycle forms. Limited food access leads to poorer health outcomes. Poorer health leads to higher medical costs. Higher medical costs reduce financial stability, and reduced financial resources make it harder to break out of the access problem in the first place. When eating well depends on your zip code, and your zip code depends on your income, the conversation has moved well beyond personal choices. It becomes a question about who actually gets to benefit from living in one of the wealthiest countries in human history. Now step back and take in the whole picture at once, because what you are looking at is not a collection of separate, unconnected problems. It is one problem with many faces: drinking water that cannot be trusted in thousands of communities, medical care that exists on paper but is financially out of reach for millions of people, fresh food that is geographically inaccessible to entire neighborhoods, transportation gaps that leave people stranded the moment a single vehicle fails, housing costs that outrun wages even for people who are fully and steadily employed, retirement systems that are no longer delivering the security they were designed to provide, an education path that now begins with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, a financial margin so thin that $400 is the difference between stability and crisis, and an underlying belief in the future that has quietly, persistently started to erode. None of these conditions are entirely new. Most of them have been visible in some form for decades. What is new is the convergence, the way they are stacking on top of each other right now. The way that erosion in one area directly accelerates vulnerability in another. The way someone who loses their car can lose their job, then lose their housing, then lose access to medical care. A chain that can unfold within weeks, not years. And nobody designed it that way. Nobody planned for these systems to fail at the same time. But they are failing at the same time, and the same households are absorbing all of it at once. The United States is an extraordinarily wealthy country. That remains true. But national wealth does not automatically translate into individual stability. The distance between those two things, between what this country produces and what ordinary people actually experience day to day, is the real story underneath all of these stories. The promise at the center of American life has never been complicated. Work hard, show up, participate in the system, and the system will hold. Security will be there when you need it. For a growing number of Americans, the system is not holding. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in a way that makes the front page every morning, but in the most ordinary moments of daily life. In the water they hesitate before drinking, the doctor's appointment they keep putting off, the grocery trip they cannot easily make, the apartment they are struggling to hold on to, the retirement that does not look the way they planned, the future they are no longer sure they can count on. The foundation is shifting. And when a foundation shifts quietly enough for long enough, The people standing on it often do not realize what has happened until the ground has already moved beneath them. If this raised a question you haven't been able to shake, what's the one thing from this video that hit closest to home? To understand how a country with a gross domestic product exceeding $28 trillion arrived at this point, it is necessary to examine the structural frameworks established decades ago. The crisis of confidence in public utilities, housing affordability, and healthcare access is not an accidental byproduct of recent economic fluctuations. It is the direct consequence of specific statutory changes, judicial decisions, and federal budgetary reallocations dating back to the late 20th century. These systemic choices created structural traps that modern working families are functionally unable to bypass. The transformation of public water infrastructure serves as a primary example of this institutional shift. Between 1977 and 2026, the federal share of capital investment in water infrastructure fell from over 30% to less than 5%. Following the passage of the Clean Water Act of 1972, the federal government initially provided substantial direct grants to municipalities to build and modernize water treatment facilities. However, during the 1980s, federal policy shifted from providing direct grants to establishing the state revolving fund systems. This framework required local municipalities to take on low-interest loans rather than receive direct federal funding. For depopulated industrial cities and impoverished rural counties, taking on millions of dollars in debt to replace aging iron and lead pipes was fiscally impossible due to a shrinking tax base. Consequently, local water systems deferred routine maintenance, leading directly to compliance failures under the Safe Drinking Water Act. By 2026, the Environmental Protection Agency recorded thousands of health-based water quality violations across municipal systems nationwide, predominantly concentrated in low-income zip codes where infrastructure funding had completely dried up. A parallel trajectory occurred within the domestic housing market, where the current deficit of affordable units traces back to legislative actions in the late 1990s. In 1998, Congress passed the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act, which included the Faircloth Amendment. This specific statutory provision legally capped the number of public housing units the federal government could fund or build, setting the baseline to the levels existing on October 1, 1999. For nearly 3 decades, the Department of Housing and Urban Development was explicitly prohibited from expanding public housing stock, even as the national population grew by over 70 million people. To replace direct public housing construction, federal policy relied on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and the Section 8 voucher program. This shifted the responsibility of providing affordable housing entirely to the private market. Private developers, incentivized by maximum profit margins, focused capital on luxury and market-rate developments, causing a severe shortage of low-cost rental units. By the mid-2020s, federal data indicated that only 1 in 4 households qualifying for federal housing assistance actually received it, due to underfunding and long municipal waiting lists. The rest were forced into the unregulated private market, where rent prices decoupled from working-class wages. This housing trap was further exacerbated by local zoning laws established in the mid-20th century. Across major metropolitan areas, municipal zoning maps dedicated over 75% of residential land exclusively to single-family detached homes. This legal restriction effectively banned the construction of higher-density multi-family housing, such as duplexes, triplexes, and courtyard apartments, which are inherently more affordable. When demand for housing surged in economic hubs, the artificially constrained supply caused land values and rents to escalate rapidly. Full-time workers earning the federal minimum wage, which remained unchanged at $7.25 per hour since 2009, were priced out of the market. The gap between housing costs and median wages expanded to a point where working-class employees spent up to 60% of their net income on shelter, leaving negligible financial reserves for food, transportation, or healthcare. The modern healthcare crisis reflects similar institutional shifts toward marketization. In 1946, the federal government passed the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, known as the Hill-Burton Act, which provided federal grants to build public hospitals, particularly in rural and low-income areas, in exchange for a commitment to provide free or below-cost care to residents who could not pay. However, during the late 20th century, federal funding mechanisms shifted toward competitive reimbursement structures under Medicare and Medicaid. This change altered the operational logic of the American medical system. Public and non-profit community hospitals were steadily consolidated or acquired by large healthcare conglomerates and private equity firms operating on a for-profit model. To maximize efficiency and investor returns, these corporations systematically closed unprofitable departments, such as labor and delivery units, and shuttered hundreds of rural facilities entirely. Between 2010 and 2026, more than 140 rural hospitals closed across the United States, creating vast geographic zones devoid of emergency and preventative medical care simultaneously. The cost of medical services escalated due to the lack of centralized price regulation. Unlike other developed nations where governments negotiate uniform fee schedules for medical procedures and pharmaceuticals, the United States maintained a fragmented commercial insurance system. This structure allowed medical providers and pharmaceutical manufacturers to set prices independently, resulting in severe price inflation. For example, the cost of insulin in the United States remained significantly higher than in any other industrialized nation, despite the underlying manufacturing technology being decades old. Although the Affordable Care Act of 2010 expanded insurance coverage through state-level Medicaid expansions and private market subsidies, it did not implement structural price caps on care. Consequently, insurance corporations increased deductibles and co-payments to protect profit margins. This policy choice shifted the direct financial burden of healthcare from the insurer to the patient. By 2026, a standard commercial insurance policy frequently carried an individual deductible exceeding $3,000, meaning a working person had to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket before their insurance coverage initiated. For an individual living paycheck to paycheck, this legal and financial barrier turned routine preventative care into a financial impossibility, converting minor treatable ailments into chronic medical emergencies. The convergence of these historical policy shifts has manifested as an acute daily crisis across modern American communities, revealing a profound clash between institutional mandates and human survival. In 2026, the operational mechanics of the domestic safety net have reached a functional dead end, characterized by regulatory gridlock, institutional profit motives, and systemic underfunding, rather than isolated anomalies. Current investigations demonstrate that municipal degradation and financial insolvency are systemic realities embedded within the modern economic landscape. A vivid illustration of this structural collapse is observed in the municipal water system of Jackson, Mississippi, and comparable systems throughout rural Alabama and central California. In Jackson, decades of municipal tax base erosion combined with decades of state-level legislative resistance to infrastructure funding, culminated in a total system failure that left over 150,000 residents without reliable running water for extended periods. When the federal government intervened via the Environmental Protection Agency to install an emergency third-party administrator, the underlying economic conflict became undeniable. Underfunded municipal authorities were legally mandated to comply with federal clean water standards, yet they possessed zero financial capacity to replace the crumbling network of water lines. To fund repairs, the city was forced to drastically increase local water utility rates, placing the financial burden directly onto an impoverished population where over 25% of residents live below the federal poverty line. Consequently, households are legally penalized and face service disconnections for failing to pay exorbitant bills for tap water that municipal health departments still classify as unsafe for human consumption. This extraction of resources from the most vulnerable sectors is mirrored precisely within the contemporary domestic housing market, where private financial institutions have directly clashed with local populations. Following the global financial crisis of 2008, global private equity firms and institutional Wall Street investors systematically acquired hundreds of thousands of foreclosed single-family homes across suburban America. By 2026, these corporate landlords controlled a significant portion of the affordable rental stock in major metropolitan areas, including Atlanta, Phoenix, and Charlotte. Corporate financial reports indicate that these entities maximize investor yields by implementing automated annual rent increases ranging from 10 to 15%, while simultaneously minimizing expenditure on property maintenance and structural repairs. According to records from municipal housing courts, corporate landlords utilize rapid, automated eviction processes to remove tenants who fall even a few $100s short on rent. This corporate accumulation of real estate has triggered an unprecedented surge in housing court filings, driving low-wage workers into severe housing insecurity. As municipal public housing authorities face multi-year backlogs due to federal funding restrictions established under the Faircloth Amendment, the resulting strain on families has created a direct conflict between immediate survival needs and long-term financial stability. Under current economic conditions, full-time workers are routinely forced into predatory financial cycles simply to maintain shelter and basic utilities. In the absence of viable state or federal wage adjustments, a vast parallel financial market composed of payday lenders, title loan companies, and high-interest online lenders has occupied the void left by traditional banking institutions. Data from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau demonstrates that millions of working-class families utilize these high-interest loan mechanisms to cover standard monthly rent increases or sudden utility surges, such as the rising residential electricity costs documented by the Urban Institute. This reliance on short-term debt instruments compounds the original financial deficit, creating an inescapable cycle of compounding interest that strips generational wealth directly from low-income neighborhoods and transfers it to corporate financial centers. This transfer of risk and cost is equally pronounced within the healthcare sector, where a stark division exists between healthcare providers and the working population. While the American Heart Association recorded national health expenditures reaching $5.3 trillion annually, representing 18% of the total domestic economy, individual healthcare consumers face unprecedented levels of medical debt. The operational reality of the modern American medical system relies on high-deductible health plans, which require individuals to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket before insurance coverage takes effect. Hospital financial audits reveal that medical debt has become the single largest cause of personal bankruptcy filings in the United States. Internal corporate collection strategies employed by major hospital networks involve placing liens on patients' primary residences, garnishing wages, and reporting medical debts to credit bureaus, which effectively locks individuals out of affordable housing markets by lowering their credit scores. www.journals.org1. The human cost of this privatized model is documented in public health statistics, which indicate a steady decline in American life expectancy relative to other high-income nations belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This mortality gap is driven directly by foregone medical care, as reported in the 2026 Commonwealth Fund evaluation. In rural regions and marginalized urban neighborhoods, the closure of community clinics has created vast medical deserts. When an individual suffers a treatable condition such as hypertension or diabetes, the lack of localized preventative care ensures that the disease progresses unchecked until it manifests as a catastrophic event, such as a stroke or organ failure. At this stage, the patient is forced to enter a hospital emergency room, which is legally required to stabilize them under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, but is not required to provide ongoing maintenance therapy. The patient is subsequently discharged back into the same environment with thousands of dollars in emergency room debt and no access to the prescription medications necessary to prevent a recurrence of the medical crisis. This cyclical degradation of human capital and physical infrastructure underscores the complete exhaustion of the institutional frameworks designed to support American life. The intersection of these crises has turned daily existence into a zero-sum equation for millions of working citizens. The resources required to secure one basic necessity, such as clean water or emergency medical care, are systematically diverted from another, such as stable housing or adequate nutrition. This structural reality has effectively trapped a massive segment of the domestic workforce inside an economic framework where consistent labor no longer translates into basic security, leaving the population to absorb the entire weight of a fracturing public architecture.